Okay, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to join your webinar and speak a little bit about the Radio Equipment Directive. My name is Michael Darby, and I work for a company called ACB Europe. So I'm not with Washington Labs as such. American certification body. We're a, as the name suggests, we deal with the certifications. So we're a TCB and an FCB, USA, Canada, Japan, and Hong Kong. We're also a notified body to the Radio Equipment Directive and the EMC Directive. We have offices worldwide, and I'm in one of our European offices in the UK, living in the south of England. Okay, so my presentation is not going to be quite as high level as Mark's. I'm going to really focus on a specific aspect of the Radio Equipment Directive, because hopefully now we're all very familiar with the RED, as it's known. Radio Equipment Directive is the RED. We don't need to say RED Directive because the D of RED means directive. And so here we are. It's deja vu all over again. But what has happened probably since about a year ago or back in the summer is that the RTTE Directive has now gone. And we are only using the Radio Equipment Directive. So I want to speak a little bit to some of the most important things that might be troubling people. And that seems to be the existence or the non-existence of ETSI standards. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some guidance documents that we have available at the moment. So just as a quick summary, if you're supplying a radio product to the EU member states, and that includes the European Economic Area or the Free Trade Association countries, if you're placing a new radio product on the market, or continuing to market an existing radio product, or you're installing a radio module into your product, and you're placing your product on the market in the EU, or maybe you've even rebranded somebody else's radio product, then you should be using the Radio Equipment Directive, or the RED, because you are placing a radio on the market in the EU. If your product is a radio device, then you will not be applying the EMC Directive and the Low Voltage Directive. Those directives apply to non-radio products. If it's a radio you have, then only the RED applies in the sense of this EMC and safety aspect. And EMC and safety is covered within the RED. Okay, so we already know the transition from the RTTE to the RED was more than just an alignment with the NLF that Mark has talked about. There are some new administrative processes, but there are also some technical changes to the requirements. And in most cases, this has meant some new testing for people. Why are these new requirements, though? Why is there new testing requirements associated with the RED? Well, it's 2018 now. 2020 is looming. The world looks very different to how it did back in 1999 when the RTTE Directive was published. And we're all talking about catchphrases like M2M and IoT. And this IoT, or Internet of Things world, means radios all over the place. As you're sitting there in your offices watching this webinar, you're probably doing it on a laptop, which is Wi-Fi enabled. You've probably got a phone in your pocket. You may even have a watch that contains a receiver or a transceiver, or both. Radios will be all around your offices and your homes, and somehow we need them to be able to interact with each other. There's a finite amount of spectrum, and this spectrum can be shared in different ways, different frequencies, use of the frequency at different times, modulation, location, or duty cycle sharing. So there are admin changes associated with the RED. Most changes observed by manufacturers are based around problems that were observed whilst using the RTTE Directive. Mark has spoken a little bit about this, the who is responsible, roles of importers or manufacturers, basically who's in trouble if it all goes wrong. And in most cases, this feels like a tightening of the requirements, but it's really how people should have been behaving under the RTTE Directive. But in addition, there are some technical changes for the RED. The most notable are the receiver performance changes. And this is because the RED introduces an expression called the efficient use of spectrum. If you're going to use the radio spectrum, not only are we now worried about the interference that we might give off, but we're interested in the radios all interacting with each other and being able to use this finite amount of spectrum in an efficient way. And what has this meant? Well, this has meant that the European Commission has given an instruction to ETSI, the Standards Writing Association, to include test cases for spectrum sharing. And this includes receiver performance. There's also some aspect of coexistence, with regard to tightening up things like duty cycle use, and some of you may have come across adaptivity, which is a fancy type of listen before talk technology. Okay, so I want to speak a little bit about these ETSI standards because I'm getting a lot of people asking me, where are the ETSI standards? What are people doing? Well, ETSI, it could be me or you, it could be any of us out there if we're involved in this engineering or compliance industry. ETSI is a standards writing organization, and while they do employ some engineers, they don't employ that many engineers, and all the standards are written by contributors who travel to ETSI to give their time to writing these standards. So they, for ETSI, well, it's us, and it's we. So you, as an interested stakeholder in this industry, are the people who write the standards. How does that work? Well, let's say we're looking for a new standard. Let's say manufacturers identify a whole new requirement, a new type of technology for a new frequency band. They can approach ETSI to create a standard. Someone starts a working group, and the standard gets written. Typically, the working group would be made up of manufacturers, spectrum regulators, test labs, notified bodies. Maybe the standard is based on existing band use, or maybe it's a whole new frequency band. If the standard is good and acceptable, an EC decision may be made around it, and the standard might become published and then maybe even listed on the official journal. If the standard already exists and someone needs to make a change to it, well, then somebody would notify ETSI of this requirement to make a change. And maybe it's a manufacturer, but in this case, it was the European Commission who said, you need to change your standards because there's a new requirement in the red. Okay, so then the same process would take place with people traveling to ETSI to contribute to writing the new standard. Once ETSI publishes a standard, it's formally known as Harmonized at that point because the ETSI members have agreed on it. If the European Commission chooses that it's acceptable for use against the directive or use with the directive, then it becomes listed on a thing called the official journal. So the official journal of harmonized standards. Often we use the word harmonized, we say harmonized standard, but we really mean that it's a harmonized standard which has been listed on the official journal. At that point, if that standard is fully applied, it can be used to provide a presumption of conformity with the applicable part of the directive. It's quite a strange expression, presumption of conformity, so let's have a little look at it. What does it really mean? Well, if you have a presumption of conformity with an aspect of the directive, then it's really up to somebody else to come along and justify to you why they think your product doesn't comply. If you don't have a presumption of conformity, then you're going to have to put some extra effort in for you to justify why you think it does comply. So legally, in the EU, does it really matter? Well, legally not so much. You can use a harmonized standard and have presumption of conformity, or you can use a non-harmonized standard and go about it in other routes, maybe involve a notified body in some cases. But there are legal routes available whether you use a harmonized standard or not. But be warned, we're all pragmatic business people here. There are some regions of the globe that use the European compliance approach as their own type approval, if you like. And sometimes they don't understand the nuances of our process, and so they may expect to see the latest standard. Okay, what about existing products already on the market then? Well, old R&TTE directive compliant products do not just simply meet the red by default. From a technical point of view, products already compliant to the R&TTE directive using the old R&TTE directive standards cannot assume to meet the red based on their old tests. As we said a moment ago, in many cases, the latest technical requirements are generally tougher because they may have had additional receiver test cases added. I hear people say, well, my product hasn't changed, so there's no problem. Or, well, we've never had any complaints before, so there shouldn't be a problem. But you've got to remember that a significant part of the RED is to prepare for a very near future environment with radios all over the place. The radio may not have changed, and you may not have experienced complaints before, but our radio environment is changing, and the state of the art and how we use our products is changing. And that's what's prompting the directive to change and then the standards to change. And the whole process with the European compliance is that we must therefore reassess our products if we wish to continue selling them or placing them on the market. I've worked with manufacturers recently who have literally had to cease production of long-standing existing radio product ranges because they simply can't meet these new requirements. Let's have a look then at the standards timeline. Well, these standards are constantly in progress. As of the 2nd of February 2018, there are 156 standards listed on the Official Journal of Harmonized Standards for the RED. Some standards have been listed with a limitation, you should be warned, and always look closely. Just because your standard is on the Official Journal, there could be a note underneath it. For example, it might say that the standard only gives you presumption of conformity for the transmitter part. So if you only have a transmitter, you're okay. But if you have a receiver or a transceiver, then really that standard does not give you presumption of conformity for your product. Are the new RED standards different to the old R&TT standards? Well, yes, in many cases they are. In fact, in most cases they are. Additional receiver tests have been added to many of the existing standards, and spectrum sharing requirements may have been included. There are some types of device, particularly the licensed devices, licensed transceivers, such as the cellular ones or microwave links, where they already had a lot of receiver test cases, so they may not have changed too much. The biggest changes will have been seen by the short-range device and unlicensed transmitter products or unlicensed transceivers, where perhaps there was not sufficient receiver testing before. So, in addition to the RED changes, some companies have taken this opportunity to go to ETSI and say, look, the standard's open for draft anyway, and there's things I've always wanted to add to it, so I'm here now, and I'm going to change it. So you may notice some changes to the standards, inclusion of new technology types, new test procedures, for example, and you may think, well, these don't really apply to the RED. But that could be just a case of somebody going to ETSI and saying, look, the standard's open, I want to make some changes anyway. So let's have a look at some of the typical changes that we've seen in standards. I'm going to start by talking about existing standards that have just been updated. These are standards which did exist for the R&TT directive and have had an update for the RED. Manufacturers of products using these standards are using the same standard as before, but with changes to the test cases or the requirements or the limits. Therefore, the manufacturer is familiar with the standard, but it's changed. In some cases, even, the standard you're looking at now is really just a preliminary version of the standard because the changes were expected to be quite significant, and they're kind of doing a stepped approach. So in many cases, ETSI have put out a standard now, maybe it's on the official journal, and then they're already working on a next version. Let's look at some common examples. EN 300-328, very well known for Bluetooth, Zigbee, Wi-Fi. Additional receiver blocking tests have been added for all devices since the RED started. So if you have a device like that using Bluetooth, Zigbee, 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, then in the transition from the R&TT directive to the RED, you will have been required to perform additional receiver blocking test cases. Similarly for EN 301893 for 5 gigahertz wireless LAN, additional receiver blocking tests to meet the RED. But in addition, technology types are changing in that band, and so changes have been made to the existing adaptivity test cases to accommodate new types of technology. That new requirement has kind of been unleashed in a stepped effect, and it becomes mandatory this summer. EN 300/220 for short-range devices in the 25 MHz to 1 GHz band. It's now been split into multiple sections with additional receiver tests added. EN 300/440 for short-range devices from 1 GHz to 40 GHz. Originally was published as a red version without any changes and allowed for receiver category 3 devices without any receiver testing, which was quite a surprise to a lot of us. I guess it shouldn't therefore have been no surprise when it was rejected by the Commission as considered insufficient to show compliance with the red. It has been listed as a harmonized standard on the official journal, but only if you apply the test cases applicable for receiver category 1 devices. And there is an amended version on its way. Okay, some further notes on these standards. 300/328, version 2.1.1 was listed on the official journal in January last year. Version 2.2.0 is in progress now, with changes to the receiver blocking requirements. That's expected to be listed on the official journal in November of this year. 300/220-2, a common one for short-range devices, was listed on the red official journal in March last year. Version 3.2.0 is in progress now with the removal of receiver category 3. So if you're making products now and you've recently made the transition to these new red standards, you've got to remember that you've got yet more testing and more changes in your near future. Those dates, by the way, will be the first dates that they arrive on the official journal. There'll be a transition period, I'm sure. Another example, 300/440 was listed on the official journal in July last year. Version 2.2.0 is in progress now, adding receiver test cases for receiver category 3. Okay, so those are for existing standards just being updated. Remember that manufacturers should keep a close eye on the development of the standards they use for compliance with their devices. Changes in the standard could require a reassessment or retest. The DOC to the red is dynamic and applies to each new unit of a product placed on the market in the EU on each new day. And remember that product means each physical unit. You're not talking about a whole model range. There's no certification or grandfathering of authorizations when the requirements change. Okay, so we looked at standards that the same standard applies, but it's had a new version. Now we're going to look at some examples of products that might use a completely new standard under the red. NFC, RFID, GPS receivers, wireless chargers. The manufacturers of these types of products are familiar with radio testing because those products were covered under the IEEE Directive. But now, under the red, they've got a completely new standard to test to. And there are changes in what tests they need to do, certainly. Typically, there'll be additional receiver and spectrum sharing tests to do. But in most cases, also, the standard has changed completely format. Now, bear in mind that ETSI standards are contributor-driven and people turn up and write the standards. Now try and imagine two different groups of people turning up to write two separate standards. You can imagine the standards won't be written exactly the same. So here are some examples. NFC RFID previously had its own dedicated standard, but it's now covered in the generic 300/330 standard. Performance requirements are comparable if you want to sit there and compare them side by side for a long time, but the test cases themselves are different. GPS receivers, they didn't actually have a dedicated standard under the old IEEE Directive. People used to just test the emissions to 300/440. Now they have a dedicated standard, EN 303/413. That's the radio performance standard for this GPS receiver. Completely new test cases exist for those devices. Wireless chargers or wireless power transfer. They were covered by the generic 300/330 standard before, but now they have their own dedicated EN 303/417 standard. Now there's a third group of people who were out of scope of the of the RTTE directive before. So these people have never been in the scope of a radio directive in the EU, and now they suddenly are. Examples are radio devices below 9 kHz and broadcast receivers. Now these people will have had to apply the EMC directive and the low voltage directive in the past when the RTTE directive was in place. Now that the RTTE directive has gone and the radio equipment directive is in, these are suddenly in scope of the RED, and they are no longer in scope of the EMC directive and the low voltage directive. So the manufacturers of these products are completely new to some of these radio performance test cases. Of course, they'll still be doing EMC test cases on the radio link operation on the product, but they'll also be monitoring the radio link now rather than just the general operation of the product. Some common examples then, where there is a short-range device standard in progress for devices below 9 kHz, and also some types of technology have managed to develop their own product-specific standard, such as robotic lawnmowers. Broadcast receivers, sound and television. I'll be honest, these are products that are kind of expected to have some problems because these have never had to cope with receiver performance before, and this is completely new test cases for them. And they have their own dedicated standards now, which did not exist before. Okay, so where are those standards? Well, a lot of them are listed on the official journal of Harmonized Standards, but some of them are not. It's the radio test standard. Now, let's go back a step here. To meet the RED, to meet the Radio Equipment Directive, there are three aspects you've got to think about in the most part. There's the safety, which is Article 3.1a. There's the EMC, which is Article 3.1b, and then there's the radio performance, which is Article 3.2. And they've all got different standards, and they all need to be applied to meet the RED. If the radio performance standard is not yet listed on the official journal, then you're going to need to go to a notified body to get a notified body's EU type examination certificate. You can't state compliance with the directive without using a notified body and their certificate if you have not used a radio standard which was listed on the official journal. You do not need a notified body if your EMC or safety standards were not listed on there. So if your EMC or safety standards are not on the official journal, well, that obviously makes it a little harder for you to find which standards apply, and you may need to do some digging around to find the appropriate standard. But once you've applied the most appropriate standard for you, you do not need a notified body. It's always an option, of course. As a notified body, we give a lot of type examination certificates to products that want their EMC and safety assessed, and it's a service we're happy to provide, but you do not legally need it. Notified bodies have been helpful in bridging the gap where standards were not harmonized and continue to do so, while some standards are still not listed on the official journal. Many radio standards are now listed on the official journal, though, and notified bodies are still useful for checking everything has been done correctly. Often people just want us to check that we've done the admin paperwork, that they've done the admin paperwork correctly. There is a RED guide by the EU Commission that's been published last year in a version 1 with some of the most complicated or controversial issues missing, if you like. And they're now working on a draft version 2 where they hope to complete those items. The guide cannot change the RED, so if you've read something in the Radio Equipment Directive and it seems clear, then that's the way it is. The guide won't change it, but the guide does clarify some things that may not be clear. So if you are a manufacturer out there, or if you're a test lab or consultant working with a manufacturer, the first thing to do is look at your product range, because some products have come into scope of the RED that were EMC directive and low voltage directive before. Or if you've got a hardwired telecoms device, well, you were in scope for the RTTE directive, but you're not in scope for the RED. If you remain in scope of the RED, has your standard changed? Is it a new standard or a new version of the old one? Does your device meet those new requirements? Delta testing may be needed, and you may suddenly need a notified body to get an EU type examination certificate. There's some other guidance documents in progress I just wanted to mention. We have the Red Guide, of course, but there's also an association called the REDCA, Radio Equipment Directive Compliance Association, primarily for RED notified bodies, but anyone can be a member. And they produce technical guidance notes. The European Commission are observers on this association, and so they do get to see and approve, if you like, the technical guidance notes. Some of the hot topics that are being discussed at the moment are modules, radio modules, the assessment of a radio module, and the installation of a radio module. It's a big topic, and that technical guidance note is being driven by myself. There's also other technical guidance notes, one on combining multiple radios into a host product, one on the risk assessments, one on radios into vehicles or vehicles with radios installed, and other explanations such as radio determination equipment. So let's have a quick look at that one on radio modules. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's useful for anybody who makes and tests a radio module, but also for anyone who wishes to install a CE-marked radio module into their product. Both topics are covered in that TGN. It's important to note that, of course, there's no certification in the EU and there's no modular approval. It's all about a declaration of conformity on the end final product. So if you install a radio module into your host product and you supply that end combination of products to the market, then you are the radio equipment manufacturer. The notes on combining radios together, well, it sounds very similar, and there are overlaps, but it's a reminder really that if you start putting multiple modules into radios into your product, then you can end up with all sorts of complicated things that really need to be assessed in detail. Okay, so I think that's me done. I will say goodbye for now and hand over to Mark, who's going to wrap it up. So thank you very much, Mark, for allowing me to join your webinar, and I hope everybody has enjoyed my words today. But my contact details are on these slides. Please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you.